He saved a dying baby lion, then came face to face with the lion's father. And what happened next was completely different from everything we think we know about wild animals. The desert was quiet when Ethan Cole knelt down in the sand, holding a dying baby lion against his chest. The baby lion could barely breathe, and its body felt cold. Then he felt it, heavy footsteps behind him. When he turned around, a huge male lion stood just a few steps away, staring at the man who was holding his baby. There was nowhere to run. And in that moment, Ethan had no idea that his choice would change their lives forever. The Arizona afternoon looked peaceful from far away. The kind of wide, open quiet that makes you think nothing bad can happen here. But up close, it was different. Heat rose up from the sand like invisible flames. The wind dragged thin ribbons of dust across the hard ground and pushed them through Ethan Cole's clothes, into his mouth, into his lungs. The sun was low enough to make long shadows from the rocks, turning every rock into something that could be hiding a secret. Ethan didn't notice any of it. He was on his knees in the red dirt, shoulders bent forward like he was trying to protect the world with just his body. In his arms, very carefully, like he was holding a candle in a storm, was a baby lion. Not a storybook baby lion. Not the cartoon kind with a bright smile and perfect fur. This one was small and real and very, very light. Its golden fur was covered with dust, and its tiny ribs moved up and down in uneven breaths. Its paws were too big, like it hadn't grown into its body yet. Its eyes, still that newborn blue, kept opening and closing like the world was too heavy to look at. Ethan's hands were big and scarred, the hands of a man who had spent years carrying hoses and axes, pulling strangers out of smoke. But now they were shaking, not from fear, but from the terrible weight of holding something that might die anyway. "Come on," he whispered, his voice rough from wind and dust. "Stay with me. Just stay." The baby lion made a sound so quiet it could have been the wind itself. A tiny, broken little cry. Ethan held it tighter, pressing the baby lion to the warmth of his chest. He could feel its heartbeat, not strong, not steady, but there. A small flicker, refusing to go out. He looked toward the sandy road behind him. His truck was out there somewhere, beyond a hill where the desert rolled away like an ocean. He could almost picture the cooler in the passenger seat, the medical bag he kept just in case, the radio that sometimes worked if the sky felt right. None of it mattered right now because the desert had gone quiet in a way Ethan had learned to fear. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was silence like something was about to happen. The birds had stopped. The insects had gone still. Even the wind, for one strange moment, seemed to stop, like it didn't want to be here for what came next. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A heaviness behind him, a weight in the air, the instinct on his neck that didn't come from heat. In his line of work, there were warnings you didn't ignore. In wildfires, a change in the wind could turn the world into a wall of fire in seconds. In wild places, the wrong kind of quiet could mean you weren't alone anymore. Ethan's skin tightened with that old familiar knowledge. Then the ground made a soft, heavy thud. One footstep, then another, heavy, careful, close. Ethan's breathing stopped. His arms locked around the baby lion, not to keep it from falling. He knew better than that, but like his body could somehow hide it. He didn't move. He didn't jerk his head. The smallest sudden motion could look like panic, like a threat, like weakness. He forced his hands to stay still. The baby lion's chest moved against his shirt. Another step landed behind him, close enough that Ethan felt it through the dirt, through his bones. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stand, to run, to get away. Any distance between himself and whatever was coming. But he couldn't run. Not without leaving the baby lion behind. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, reasons that lived deeper than thinking, deeper than the training that told him how to survive, Ethan knew he couldn't do that. Not again. His mouth was dry. His throat burned. He looked down at the baby lion's face and whispered so quietly it was almost a thought. "Don't make a sound, buddy. Please." He didn't know if the baby lion understood words, but sometimes animals understood fear. And Ethan's fear had a heartbeat of its own. The footsteps stopped. A shadow fell over Ethan's knees, stretching long across the dirt. It didn't belong to any rock. It didn't match the angle of the sun. It belonged to something standing behind him. Ethan swallowed slowly and carefully, like he was trying to keep the motion from traveling down his back. He breathed in through his nose and tasted dust and something else. Something wild, alive, and impossible to mistake. Lion. Ethan kept his head still. He moved only his eyes, just enough to catch a glimpse of what stood behind him. A mane, dark and thick, lifting slightly in the wind. A side of pure muscle. A tail that flicked once. Not frantic, not angry, but patient. His heart hammered against his ribs. Slowly, carefully, Ethan turned his head. And there it was. A full-grown male lion stood less than 10 feet away. It was bigger than Ethan had ever seen up close, outside of a fence. Even at Desert Haven, even from a safe distance behind steel and wire, Ranger had felt huge. But out here, in open air, with nothing between them, huge didn't cover it. The lion's shoulders rose like a boulder from the earth. Its paws looked like they could crush a skull without effort. Its mane was a deep, sunburned brown, almost black in places, framing a face that held an ancient power. Scars crossed one shoulder, pale lines beneath the fur, telling stories Ethan could only guess at. The lion's nose moved, breathing in the air, tasting it. Then those golden eyes locked on Ethan. Not on his face first, on the baby lion. Ethan's blood turned cold. Of course it would be the baby lion. That baby in Ethan's arms was not just a hurt animal. It was someone's child. A child Ethan had taken. A child Ethan had tried to save. And now the father was here. Ethan didn't know how the lion had found him this quickly. He didn't know how far it had traveled, or what made it track the smell of blood and milk and fear across miles of sand and thorn. He only knew the simple, terrible truth. He was holding this lion's baby. And the desert offered nowhere to hide. Ethan's mind went fast and sharp, the way it did in emergencies. Counting angles, distance, options. His truck was too far. No tree nearby worth climbing. No rock big enough to stand between him and the animal if it decided to attack. And even if there had been, he couldn't outrun a lion. No one could. The lion took one step forward. Ethan froze so hard it felt like his bones turned to glass. He didn't lift his hands. He didn't stand. He didn't try to look bigger. Every survival rule he'd ever learned screamed at him to do something. But a deeper instinct, quieter, steadier, told him the one thing he could do was not make things worse. So Ethan stayed exactly where he was. He lowered his gaze slightly, not staring into the lion's eyes like a challenge. He kept his breathing slow, careful, on purpose. The baby lion shifted in his arms, a tiny movement that made Ethan's stomach drop. Its head fell weakly to the side, and its paw twitched like it was reaching for something that wasn't there. The lion's ears turned forward. Ethan's hands tightened around the baby lion's body, not squeezing, never that, just holding more safely, like a promise. He could hear his own heart, loud in his ears. He could feel sweat slide down his ribs. The air seemed thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. The lion's gaze flicked up to Ethan's face now. And in that gaze, Ethan saw something he didn't expect. Not mindless anger, not immediate attack, something else. Cold, focused, almost thinking, like the lion wasn't just reacting, like it was reading him, judging the man who dared to touch what belonged to it. Ethan's lips parted. He didn't plan to speak, but a whisper slipped out anyway, dry and shaking. "I'm not trying to take him from you," he said softly. "I'm trying to keep him alive." The words sounded silly the moment they left his mouth. As if a lion cared about explanations. As if language mattered here. But Ethan had spent enough time around animals to know something people forgot. They listened to tone. They listened to honesty. They listened to whether your body lied. And Ethan's body wasn't lying. He wasn't here to fight. He was here because a small life was fading. And he couldn't watch it happen. The lion stopped again, close enough now that Ethan could see individual hairs of mane, could see dust clinging to the whiskers near its mouth. The animal's chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm that seemed impossibly calm for something that could end Ethan in a second. Ethan's arms began to ache from holding the baby lion, but he didn't move. He didn't risk it. The lion's nose moved again. It stepped sideways just slightly, changing the angle so it could see the baby lion more clearly. And that was the moment Ethan understood. This wasn't about him. Not yet. This was about the baby lion, the lion's child. Ethan swallowed hard, and his voice came out as a strained whisper. Half prayer, half confession. "If you're his dad," he breathed, "then you already know. I found him like this. I didn't do this to him." The lion blinked once, slow. Then it took another step forward, close enough now that if it attacked, Ethan wouldn't even have time to flinch. The baby lion made another faint sound, smaller than a kitten's cry. The lion's eyes narrowed. Ethan's throat tightened until it hurt. The desert air felt suddenly too thin. He could picture headlines. He could picture the sanctuary board meetings. He could picture Marissa's face, stern and angry, if Ethan never came back. But none of that was what scared him. What scared him was the thought that this lion, this father, would decide the baby should die in the wild the way nature meant it to. That Ethan's hands, his stubborn human hands, were delaying an ending that was already written. He tightened his grip and whispered to the baby lion, "You've come this far. Don't quit on me." The lion's shadow covered Ethan completely now. The animal lowered its head. Ethan's breath caught so sharply it felt like choking. And as the lion's nose drifted closer, close enough that Ethan could feel warm breath across his knuckles, Ethan realized he had reached the edge of every plan he'd ever made. There was only one thing left. Trust. Not trust in luck. Trust in whatever connection his heart insisted could exist, even out here, even with a hunter built by nature to kill. Ethan's voice came out barely heard, like the last words of a man standing on a cliff. "Okay," he whispered. "If this is where it ends, then it ends with me trying." And the lion's nose hovered inches from the baby lion's face, like it was deciding what the next breath of the world would be. If this is where it ends, then it ends with me trying. The words still echoed in Ethan Cole's chest long after the desert moment slipped backward in time, peeling away like heat haze to show the life that had carried him there. Before lions and sand and impossible choices, Ethan's world had been fire. Not the quiet kind that flickers in a fireplace, but the roaring, living walls of flame that climbed hillsides and jumped over treetops with a hunger of their own. For nearly 10 years, Ethan had been a wildland firefighter, one of the men who ran toward smoke when everyone else ran away. He had learned how heat moved, how wind could betray you without warning, how the land itself could turn into an enemy in seconds. Fire taught him discipline. It taught him respect. And then it taught him loss. The night it happened, the sky had turned the color of rusted iron. Wind shifted without warning, the kind of sudden change that experienced crews feared most. Ethan remembered shouting, orders, warnings, names, his voice swallowed by the roar. A wall of flame collapsed sideways faster than anyone could outrun. One man didn't make it back. Ethan saw it happen, saw the moment, and for the rest of his life, he would replay the same thought on an endless loop. If I had been faster, if I had noticed sooner, if I had chosen differently. After the fire was out, after the ashes cooled, Ethan found that he couldn't sleep without smelling smoke that wasn't there. Couldn't stand the sound of wind through dry grass without his heart speeding up. He stayed with the department longer than he should have, stubbornly proving to his bosses, to himself, that he was still useful. But something inside him had already burned down. He left without ceremony. No speeches, no goodbyes worth remembering. Just a bag, a truck, and a silence that felt heavier than any fire line. That silence eventually led him to the outskirts of Arizona, to a place most people never saw unless they were lost or looking for something they couldn't name. Desert Haven Wildlife Sanctuary sat at the edge of nothing. A stretch of scrub, rock, and sun that looked empty until you learned how to read it. Ethan liked that. The land didn't pretend to be gentle. It didn't promise safety. It just existed. The sanctuary wasn't a zoo. There were no crowds, no fences meant for comfort. It was a place for animals that had fallen through cracks, rescued from illegal ownership, roadside accidents, abandoned cages, animals that couldn't be released fully into the wild, but still deserved dignity. Ethan started doing maintenance, fences, water lines, anything that kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. But animals had a way of pulling people closer, especially people who knew what it meant to carry damage. He learned their rhythms, their moods, the difference between fear and anger, the way stillness could be louder than sound. And then there was Ranger. Ranger was the largest male lion Desert Haven had ever taken in. A former private collection animal given up after the owner realized that raising a lion was not the same as having power. Ranger had scars. Real ones, not the dramatic kind meant for sympathy. Old injuries, old fights, proof of a life where survival wasn't guaranteed. He ruled the outer area with a calm that unsettled new staff. Ranger didn't pace endlessly like some big cats. He watched. He observed. He saved energy in a way that felt intelligent. Ethan respected him from a distance. Dr. Marissa Lane, the sanctuary's lead veterinarian, made the rules clear from the beginning. Marissa was sharp, careful, and famously strict when it came to rules. She believed deeply in right and wrong, in limits, in not letting emotion turn animals into experiments, especially breeding situations. She'd told Ethan once, standing beside the fence as Ranger passed like a shadow behind them. If a lion gives birth out there, we watch. We do not get involved. Nature decides. Ethan had nodded. He understood the thinking. He even agreed with it. Until the storm came. The dust storm rolled in without much warning. A towering wall of dust that swallowed the sky and turned day into something close to night. Wind tore through the valley, snapping branches, pushing debris against fencing that had held for years. By morning, Desert Haven looked like it had been shaken and put back down wrong. Ethan volunteered for the fence check. It was familiar work. Walk, look, repair. The kind of job that kept his mind from wandering. That was when he saw the damage. A section of outer fencing had collapsed where a tree had come down hard. The ground beyond it was torn up, marked by frantic movement. And running through the sand was a thin, unmistakable trail, darkened by blood. Ethan followed it without thinking. He told himself it was part of his job, that he needed to check the risk, write it down. But deeper down, he knew that same instinct from the fire line had woken up. The one that acted before fear could catch up. The trail led him into a shallow dip scattered with broken rock and thorny brush. And there, tucked against stone and shadow, was the baby lion. Too small to defend itself, too weak to cry loudly, tangled in twisted wire torn from the fence. Ethan remembered standing there, heart pounding, the rulebook screaming inside his head. He remembered thinking of Marissa's voice, calm and absolute. We do not get involved. And then he remembered the sound of a man calling his name through smoke. Ethan didn't think about it any longer. He acted. Which was how he ended up running across the desert with a dying baby lion pressed against his chest, breaking every rule that had ever kept him safe. And which was why, hours later, he found himself on his knees in the sand, holding that same baby lion as a shadow rose behind him, proof that nature had come to collect what he'd taken. The lion behind him didn't know Ethan's past. It didn't know about fire or guilt or promises made to the dead. It only knew one thing. Someone was holding its child. And Ethan Cole was about to learn whether kindness was something the wild recognized or punished. And Ethan Cole was about to learn whether kindness was something the wild recognized or punished. The desert didn't answer that question right away. Instead, it pulled Ethan backward into the hours before the meeting, to the moment when the choice had first appeared, quietly at his feet, disguised as routine. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp. The air still tasted of dust, and the land looked scraped raw, like something huge had dragged its claws across the valley and moved on. Ethan walked the fence alone, boots crunching over gravel, radio clipped to his shoulder and silent except for static. He noted the downed tree, the torn fence, the way the earth beyond it looked wrong, disturbed in a way that wasn't caused by wind. Then he saw the marks. They weren't obvious at first. Just a faint line in the sand, darker than the rest, winding away from the broken fence. Ethan crouched, brushing his fingers over it. Dried blood. Not much, but enough. Nearby, a tuft of pale fur clung to a thorn, swaying slightly in the breeze. Ethan stood slowly. Predators left cleaner scenes. This was messy, desperate. Far off, a sound drifted across the flats. A thin, rising call that made his shoulders tense. Coyotes. Too early in the day for them to be this bold, unless something small and helpless had drawn their attention. Ethan followed the trail without telling himself why. The land sloped downward into a shallow dip where rocks broke the wind and shadows pulled even in daylight. He picked his way carefully, scanning ahead, every sense sharp. The trail ended there, beneath a slab of stone that had collapsed at an angle, leaving a narrow pocket of shade. That was where he saw the baby lion. At first, it looked like a bundle of cloth tossed aside, golden, still, half buried in sand. Then it shifted, just barely, and Ethan's breath caught. The baby lion was tangled in twisted wire, the kind used to strengthen fencing. One back leg was caught tight, the metal biting deep enough to darken the fur around it. The baby's sides moved in shallow, uneven pulls. Its eyes were open, but unfocused, like it was staring through the world instead of at it. Ethan dropped to his knees. "Hey," he said softly, without thinking. "Easy." The baby lion didn't react. It didn't cry out. It didn't struggle. That scared him more than anything else. Ethan scanned the area, his heart ticking louder in his ears. No sign of the pride, no sign of Ranger, just the open sky and the distant warning calls of scavengers waiting for what they thought would happen. He reached for his radio, then stopped. "Protocol." Marissa's voice. "We watch. We do not get involved." He could call it in. He could stand back and write down what happened. He could tell himself this was nature fixing itself, that not every life was meant to be saved. Ethan stared at the baby lion's chest, counting the breaths. 1, 2. A pause. Too long. The wire had to be cut. Even a few more minutes like this, and blood flow would fail completely. Ethan's hands hovered, shaking slightly. He thought of fire again, of moments when doing nothing had felt like following orders, and how that obedience had echoed long after the flames died. He thought of the weight he still carried, of the promise he'd made to himself that he wouldn't walk away when he was the only one there. "No," he said quietly, the word landing solid in his chest. "Not today." He moved fast then, all hesitation burned away. He cut the wire, careful not to jolt the baby lion. The metal snapped free, springing back into the sand. The baby lion made a weak sound. Not fear, not pain, just the smallest sign that the world was changing. Ethan slipped off his jacket and wrapped the baby lion in it, tucking the head close to his chest to keep it warm. The baby lion was lighter than he expected, its body barely filling the curve of his arm. As he lifted it, the baby's paw twitched and pressed faintly against his shirt. Ethan swallowed hard. "I've got you," he said, voice rough. "Just hold on." The walk back to the truck felt longer than it was. Every shadow looked like it could hide danger. Every sound made him glance over his shoulder. He kept expecting to hear a roar, to feel the earth shake with an answer to what he'd done. Nothing came. At the sanctuary, chaos greeted him. The storm had knocked out part of the power, and staff moved with tight, quick focus. Ethan didn't slow. He headed straight for the medical room, laying the baby lion down under heat lamps, starting fluids with hands that remembered how to work under pressure. Marissa arrived minutes later, her face going from confusion to alarm in a heartbeat. "Ethan," she said sharply, "what did you do?" He met her gaze without flinching. "I saved a life. You interfered. I prevented a death." They stared at each other across the table, the baby lion between them, breathing just a little more evenly now. Around them, the sanctuary hummed with held-back tension. "You understand the risk," Marissa said. "If the Father finds this place." "I know," Ethan replied. And he did. He knew exactly what he'd invited. 3 days passed, then a week. The baby lion survived. Its strength returned slowly, stubbornly. It drank, slept, and began to respond to the world again. Ethan spent hours beside it, checking vitals, adjusting care, whispering nonsense. When the night stretched long, he named the baby lion Sunny. The morning it opened its eyes fully and blinked up at him, alert and present, the sun spilling through the dusty window and lighting the room like a blessing. That same morning, Ethan found the tracks. They were huge, unmistakable, pressed deep into the sand just outside the outer fence. Not pacing, not frantic, watching. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring down at the prints. A quiet understanding settled over him like a weight. The father had come. And somewhere beyond the fence, Ranger was waiting. Ranger was waiting. Ethan felt that truth settle into his bones as he stood over the massive tracks pressed into the sand beyond the outer fence. They weren't rushed. They weren't scattered. Each print was placed with purpose, the weight of the lion sinking deep into the earth as if to mark a line rather than cross it. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. Ranger knew exactly where his son was. Inside the medical room, the baby lion, Sunny now, lay curled beneath the gentle hum of the heat lamp. The wounds had closed cleanly. The leg that once shook uselessly now twitched with returning strength. Every day, the breaths grew steadier, deeper, more confident, as if the baby lion were relearning how to belong to the world. Ethan kept watch through long hours that blurred together. He learned Sunny's rhythms, the way it pressed closer when the temperature dropped at night, the way it stilled when Ethan's hand rested on its back. There was no fear in the baby's eyes anymore. Only curiosity and something softer that Ethan tried not to name. Outside, the sanctuary moved in a state of quiet worry. Marissa tightened rules. Night patrols doubled. Staff spoke in lower voices, glancing toward the fence more often than they needed to. Ranger never showed himself directly, but his presence shaped the air. Fresh tracks appeared at dawn. Sometimes a low vibration passed through the ground in the distance, too deep to be thunder. Ethan knew the others blamed him. He didn't argue. At night, when the sanctuary settled into silence, Ethan sat alone with Sunny and let the weight of the decision press in. He thought about consequences, about how close this place came to disaster simply because he had chosen not to look away. He wondered if kindness was just another kind of pride, humans deciding they knew better than nature itself. But then Sunny would stir, lift its head with effort, and let out a sound that was no longer broken. And Ethan would remember why he stayed. The bond formed quietly, not through play or training, but through presence. Sunny learned Ethan's scent, the sound of his footsteps, the sound of his voice. After feedings, the baby would crawl toward him, small body warm and solid, curling against his chest, like it had decided this was where safety lived. Ethan never forgot what Sunny was. He didn't pretend the baby lion was a pet. He didn't speak to it like it would stay forever. Every touch was careful, measured, respectful. He wanted Sunny strong, not dependent. 3 weeks passed. The day Marissa finally spoke the words, Ethan felt both relief and dread. "It's time," she said, standing at the gate, clipboard held tight against her chest. "He's ready." Ethan nodded slowly. The release plan was simple, controlled. The baby would be returned to the area where he'd been found, within Ranger's territory, far from human buildings. It was the best chance for reunion without a fight. Morning came clear and unforgiving. Ethan carried Sunny in the same jacket he'd used that first day, though the baby filled it more fully now. Its head rose, ears flicking at every sound, instincts waking fast. The desert seemed to watch them as they walked. When they reached the release place, Ethan knelt and set Sunny down gently on the sand. For a long moment, the baby didn't move. It looked up at Ethan, eyes bright, head tilting as if searching for instruction. Ethan swallowed past the tightness in his throat. "Go on," he whispered. "This is where you belong." The air shifted. Ethan felt it before he saw it. The same heavy awareness that had once frozen him in place. He looked up just as Ranger came out from behind the rocks. The lion moved with silent power, each step careful, controlled. He didn't rush. He didn't charge. He closed the distance slowly, eyes fixed on the baby. Sunny froze. Ranger lowered his head, breath warm and steady as it washed over his son. He sniffed deeply, then reached forward and touched his tongue to Sunny's forehead. The gesture was gentle beyond belief. Ethan's breath caught. He had seen lions interact before, but never like this. Never so tender, so careful. This wasn't power. It was recognition. Ranger's eyes lifted then, locking onto Ethan. The moment stretched thin, sharp as wire. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He held the lion's gaze without challenge, without apology. Everything he felt, fear, respect, hope, settled into stillness. Ranger studied him. Then, slowly, the lion stepped back. He sat, not retreating, not attacking, waiting. Sunny glanced between them once more, then took a step toward Ranger. Then, another. Small, uncertain steps that grew steadier with each movement, until the baby pressed into his father's chest, disappearing beneath the shadow of the great mane. Ethan stayed kneeling long after they vanished into the rocks. He didn't know if Ranger's calm was trust or warning or something else entirely. He only knew one thing. The choice he'd made 3 weeks ago had not ended in blood. But the story wasn't finished. The desert did not return to normal after Sunny disappeared into the rocks. If anything, it became more alert. Ethan felt it in the days that followed, in the way the air seemed to hold tension even when nothing moved. Life at Desert Haven went back to its routines, feedings, checks, paperwork. But something invisible had shifted. Ranger had not vanished back into myth or memory. He stayed at the edges, an unseen presence that shaped behavior without ever showing itself. Tracks continued to appear at dawn, not close, not aggressive, always just far enough to remind Ethan that nothing had been forgotten. Marissa noticed too. She said little, but her eyes followed the horizon more often than before. Meetings grew shorter. The radio stayed on. The sanctuary worked, but with the quiet discipline of people who knew they were being watched. Ethan kept his distance from the release place, not out of fear, but respect. He told himself Sunny belonged to the wild now, that any longing he felt was his to manage, not the baby's burden to carry. And yet sometimes, late in the evening, he would step outside alone and scan the far ridges. Once, he could have sworn he saw movement there, gold against stone, then gone. Another time, a low sound rolled across the valley, too deep to be thunder, too controlled to be a warning. It wasn't a challenge. It felt like acknowledgement. Months passed. Summer faded into a brittle fall. The sanctuary's work continued, steady and quiet. Ethan settled back into routine, though the old restlessness never fully left him. He checked equipment, repaired fencing, helped with new animals. Life moved forward in manageable pieces. And then 2 years slipped by. The desert changed subtly with the seasons, but Ethan aged in ways the land did not. Lines deepened around his eyes. His hair lightened at the edges. The guilt he carried loosened its grip. Not gone, but quieter. No longer screaming for his attention every waking hour. Sunny became a story told only in Ethan's head. He never saw the baby again. No confirmed sightings, no markings that could be traced with certainty. Just occasional signs that Ranger still ruled the territory beyond the sanctuary. His area intact, his presence steady. Ethan accepted that as enough. Until the afternoon the truck failed. It happened miles from Desert Haven, along a seldom used service road that cut through open land toward a cluster of remote water stations. The sun hung low, hot and merciless. Ethan heard the engine sputter before it died completely, the sound echoing once before the desert swallowed it. He tried the key again. Nothing. Radio signal flickered weakly, cutting in and out like a failing heartbeat. No immediate help, no nearby buildings, just open land and a sky that would turn dark faster than expected. Ethan stepped out of the truck, scanning the horizon. He'd been alone in worse places before. He told himself this was manageable. Then he saw the movement. 3 figures at first, coming out from behind a rise. Not animals. 2 upright. 2 purposeful men. They moved with purpose, spreading slightly as they came closer, their attention fixed on him. Ethan's stomach tightened. He recognized the posture immediately. The careful balance of people who didn't want witnesses and didn't expect resistance. Poachers. They didn't need to say anything for Ethan to understand the danger. His truck disabled, his radio unreliable, his position open. He raised his hand slowly as they got closer, not in surrender, but to show he wasn't armed. One of the men smiled thinly, a look that carried no humor. "Wrong road," the man said. Ethan didn't reply. He backed toward the truck, heart hammering, mind searching for options that didn't exist. The desert grew quiet again. Too quiet. Then the sound came. Low, rolling, vibrating through the ground before it reached the air. A roar. The men froze. Ethan turned just as the sound hit again, closer now, powerful enough to raise the hair on his arms. From the ridge to the west, a shape came out. Large, confident, unmistakable. A male lion, full-grown, broad-shouldered, mane lifted by the wind. Ethan's breath caught. The lion stepped forward, eyes locked, not on Ethan, but on the men. One of the poachers cursed under his breath. Another took a step back. Then a second shape appeared beside the first. Larger, older. Ranger. The desert seemed to hold its breath as the 2 lions moved forward together, a living wall of muscle and power. The men didn't hesitate after that. Fear shattered whatever plan they'd come with. They turned and ran, boots kicking up sand as they vanished the way they'd come. Ethan didn't move. The lion stopped where the men had been standing moments before. Sunny. He knew it now without doubt. Sunny stood tall, eyes bright, stance solid. Gone was the helpless baby from the ditch. This was a hunter in his prime. Ranger stepped past him, slow and purposeful, until he stood directly in front of Ethan. Ethan lowered his hands. Neither man nor lion broke eye contact. Ranger leaned forward, close enough for Ethan to feel warm breath against his skin. The lion's nose brushed his knuckles, brief, controlled, purposeful. Not a threat. A recognition. Then Ranger turned away and began walking, pausing after several steps to glance back. Ethan understood. He followed. Sonny fell in behind them, silent as shadow. Together they moved across the land toward safety. 3 figures bound by something no rulebook could explain. And as the lights of Ethan's truck finally came into view, he realized the debt he'd created 2 years earlier had been repaid, not with violence, but with protection. The unimaginable had happened. They did not hurry him. That was the first thing Ethan noticed as he followed Ranger across the open ground. The lion's pace was unhurried, confident, like the desert itself had already agreed to make room. Each step pressed certainty into the sand. Sonny moved behind and slightly to the side, silent, alert, his presence closing the space Ethan hadn't realized he was guarding. The light was changing fast. The sun slipped lower, staining the land copper and violet, stretching shadows until they touched. Ethan felt his own breathing slow to match the rhythm of their movement. Fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed. No longer sharp, no longer panicked. It had become something closer to awe. Ranger stopped once, lifting his head to scan the horizon. The wind tugged at his mane. Somewhere far away, a vehicle engine coughed and died. Likely the poachers retreating, luckier than they deserved. Satisfied, Ranger continued. Ethan followed because there was nothing else to do. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He kept his hands visible and his posture loose, offering no challenge, no demand. Every lesson he'd learned about staying alive around fire and animals came back to him in pieces. Respect space. Read the air. Don't rush what doesn't need rushing. When the truck came into view, a dark shape against the dying light, Ethan felt a pressure in his chest he hadn't known was there. Relief arrived quietly, like a hand on the shoulder rather than a shout. Ranger slowed and stopped a short distance away. Sonny stopped too, head turning, ears rotating, reading the world. Ethan stopped with them. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Ranger stepped closer. Not close enough to touch this time, but near enough for the warmth of him to carry. The lion lowered his head, eyes half closed, and let out a breath. A breath that seemed to say, "This far and no farther." Sonny copied the motion, placing himself between Ethan and the open land beyond, just for a heartbeat. Ethan nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, knowing the word wasn't meant to be understood the way humans used it. He meant it anyway. Ranger turned first, walking back toward the ridge. Sonny followed, pausing once to look back. The look wasn't curiosity. It was confirmation. Then both lions melted into the dusk, the land closing around them as if they had never been there at all. Ethan stood alone beside his truck, hands shaking now that the danger had passed. He leaned against the door and laughed once, a short, breathless sound that surprised him. When he climbed into the cab, his fingers rested on the steering wheel until they steadied. The drive back to Desert Haven felt unreal. Headlights carved tunnels through the dark. The radio finally found a signal, voices crackling in and out. Ethan kept the volume low. He needed the quiet. At the sanctuary gate, he parked and sat for a long time before getting out. The place looked unchanged. Fences, low buildings, the familiar shapes of routine. But it felt different, like something had been set right beyond the reach of rules or planning. Marissa was waiting near the main office, arms folded against the cooling air. She took one look at Ethan's face and knew this wasn't a story that fit into reports. "You're late," she said. "Truck trouble," Ethan replied. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "We'll talk tomorrow." Ethan walked the fence alone that night. The stars burned hard and clear. Near the far fence, he found tracks, fresh, deep, purposeful, angled away from the sanctuary, not toward it. Ranger hadn't crossed the line. He hadn't needed to. Ethan crouched and traced the edge of a print with his eyes, not his hands. He felt lighter than he had in years, like the weight he'd carried since the fire had finally shifted from his shoulders to the ground. He stood and looked out into the dark. "Go well," he murmured, unsure who he was speaking to. A low sound answered from far off. Not a roar, not a warning, just a presence passing through the night. Ethan went inside and slept without dreams. Ethan did not tell anyone what truly happened that afternoon. At Desert Haven, stories had weight, and some truths were too heavy to carry without bending the rules that kept everyone safe. So he filed a report about mechanical failure, noted suspicious signs near the service road, and marked the area for more patrols. The word "poachers" was written once, carefully, and then left alone. But the desert knew. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted again, not with tension this time, but with balance. Tracks near the sanctuary grew fewer. Night patrols passed without problems. The land seemed to breathe easier, like an argument had been settled without witnesses. Ethan felt it most in himself. The old restlessness, the sharp edge that had followed him since the fire, no longer woke him before dawn. When he slept, it was deep and quiet. When he worked, it was with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. He caught himself humming once while fixing a fence, and stopped, startled by the sound of his own ease. A week later, while checking the northern boundary near sunset, Ethan saw them again. Not close, not hidden. Ranger stood on a ridge, perfectly outlined against the fading sky. Sonny was beside him, larger now than Ethan remembered from that terrible afternoon on the road. Powerful, unmistakably whole. They didn't move toward the fence. They didn't test it. They were simply there. Ethan stopped where he was. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't step closer. He just stood and let the moment exist. The wind carried their scent, dry and wild. Ranger's head lifted slightly, eyes finding Ethan with ease, as if distance had never mattered. There was no warning in his posture, no claim being made. Sonny shifted once, then settled, his attention moving across the valley like a guardian's sweep. They stayed like that for a long time. Three figures anchored in different worlds, connected by something that didn't need to cross the space between them. Ethan felt it then, with sudden clarity. The rescue had never been a deal. There was no score sheet being balanced, no bargain struck between species. What had passed between them was simpler and far more unsettling. Recognition. Ranger had seen Ethan as he was in that ditch, afraid, determined, unwilling to abandon a life even when the cost was uncertain. And Sonny, grown now into the shape of his future, had carried that recognition forward. The lions didn't owe him anything. They had chosen him. Ranger turned first, beginning the slow climb down from the ridge. Sonny stayed a heartbeat longer, eyes bright in the last of the light. Then he followed, their forms dissolving into shadow as the desert reclaimed them. Ethan let out a breath, realizing he'd been holding it. That night he sat outside the staff quarters long after the others had gone in. The sky was a field of stars, sharp and countless. Somewhere far off, a low sound rolled through the dark. Deep, controlled, familiar. Not a roar. A statement. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees and let the sound wash over him. He thought of the baby tangled in wire, of hands shaking around a life too small to protect itself, of the moment he'd knelt in the sand, believing the world might end there. Instead, it had widened. For the first time since leaving the fire line, Ethan understood something he had been circling for years. Saving a life didn't erase loss. It didn't rewrite the past. But it changed the shape of the future in ways that couldn't be measured or predicted. The desert had given him back something he hadn't known how to ask for. Peace. The desert never asked Ethan Cole to explain what happened. Weeks passed, then months, and life at Desert Haven settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than forced. Patrols continued. Repairs were made. New rescues arrived, carrying their own quiet tragedies. The sanctuary did what it had always done, held space for lives that had nowhere else to go. But something basic had changed. Ethan felt it each morning when he stepped outside before sunrise and didn't brace himself for the day. The horizon still stretched wide and tough, but it no longer felt like a challenge he had to survive. It felt like a place that knew him, a place that had seen him at his most afraid and had not turned him away. He never saw Ranger again up close. That was as it should be. Sometimes on the far ridges he would catch a glimpse of movement at dusk. Two shapes, one larger, one younger, framed briefly against the sky before slipping back into the land. Other times there was only a sound carried on the wind, low and steady, as if the desert itself were speaking in a voice too old for words. Ethan never followed. He understood now that some connections existed precisely because they were not chased. On a cool evening in late fall, Ethan stood at the edge of the sanctuary fence, watching the last light drain from the sky. The air smelled of dust and sage. The world felt complete in a way it rarely did. He thought back to the ditch, to the wire biting into small flesh, to the moment his hands had closed around a life he wasn't supposed to touch. He remembered kneeling in the sand, believing he might die there, believing that kindness had finally led him too far. Instead, it had led him home. Ethan realized that the fire he had run from for so many years hadn't destroyed him. It had shaped him for this exact moment. It had taught him urgency. It had taught him consequence. And the desert, in its own unforgiving way, had taught him grace. There were things the science world would never be able to measure about what had happened. Memory, recognition, choice. Ethan knew better now than to try to force meaning into numbers. Some truths lived outside explanation. They lived in the way a father recognized the man who refused to abandon his child. They lived in the way a grown lion stepped between danger and a human without hesitation. They lived in the quiet understanding that kindness, once given freely, did not vanish into the wild. It traveled, waited, and returned when it mattered most. As darkness fully claimed the valley, Ethan rested his hands on the fence and whispered, not to the lions, not to the desert, but to the part of himself that had once believed survival was the only victory that mattered. "We're even," he said softly. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere far beyond the lights of the sanctuary, a presence passed through the night. Unseen, unclaimed, and unforgettable. Ethan turned back toward the buildings, toward work that still needed doing, toward lives that would arrive broken and hopeful all over again. He walked with steady steps, no longer haunted by the past, no longer waiting for something to be taken from him. The desert had kept its memory, and it had chosen mercy. If this story touched your heart, let me ask you something simple. Do you believe animals can remember kindness? If you do, type 1 in the comments. If you don't, type 0. I read every single one. And if you'd like to hear more true stories about the quiet bonds between humans and the wild, please consider subscribing. Because sometimes the most powerful connections in life are the ones that don't need words.